Hey there, night owls. Or, semi conscious time travelers trapped in the liminal space between I should be asleep and what if I learned about medieval sleep patterns instead? Welcome back to another long, slow, mildly unsettling stroll through history. Tonight, we're dimming the candlelight, fluffing our straw mattresses, and sliding back about 6 or 7 centuries to a world where people didn't actually sleep the way we do now. Yeah, turns out our ancestors didn't just collapse after doom scrolling and pass out till morning. They actually divided their nights in half. Two sleeps. First sleep and second sleep. And yes, that's exactly what it sounds like. They'd go to bed early, wake up in the middle of the night, hang out for a bit, and then go back to sleep again. Because of course they did. So get comfortable, maybe grab a warm drink, maybe a medieval style one, some watered down wine or a questionable ale that's been sitting out since sunset. And let's drift back to a time when the night was long, dark, and very, very inconvenient. Now, this idea of two sleeps isn't some obscure footnote historians just made up to sound mysterious. It's real, it's well documented, and honestly, it makes a lot of sense once you remember how weirdly dark and cold the medieval world was. Let's picture it. You're living in, say, England in the year 1400. The day is short, the sun sets before dinner, and your main source of light after that is a smoky candle that smells vaguely of sheep fat. There's no Netflix, no 24-hour lighting, and no reason to pretend you're a night owl, because the night is for ghosts, thieves, and the occasional plague. So, people went to bed early, like really early. We're talking 8 or 9 p.m., sometimes even earlier in winter. And after about 4 hours, they'd naturally wake up. Around midnight, maybe 1 or 2 in the morning. That waking period, that was totally normal. They call it the watch, or simply the time between the first and second sleeps. And here's where things get unexpectedly cozy. People didn't panic when they woke up at 1 a.m. like we do today. They didn't reach for melatonin or spiral about their circadian rhythm. No, they just got up, stretched, maybe stirred the fire a bit, and did whatever nighttime tasks seemed fitting, which could be pretty much anything. Some prayed. A lot of praying happened, apparently. The hours between the two sleeps were considered spiritually potent, perfect for whispering a few psalms or having a little existential chat with God. Monks loved this concept. The night vigil hours fit right into the holy schedule, because of course monks would turn insomnia into a religious discipline. Others used the time more practically. You might get up, check on your livestock, fix a tool, relieve yourself in your charming wooden chamber pot, or chat with whoever else was awake. Couples might use that quiet hour to talk privately, or, well, reconnect. Let's just say medieval writers were very polite about implying that the middle of the night was ideal for marital recreation. If you were wealthy, maybe you'd light a candle and read by the fire. If you were a peasant, you might sit in the dark and think about how expensive candles were. Some households even use the time to visit neighbors, which honestly sounds wild. Imagine someone knocking on your door at 2 a.m. like, "Hey, couldn't sleep, thought I'd stop by." Totally normal back then. Now, what's fascinating is that nobody thought this was weird. The concept of sleeping through the whole night, the way we do now, didn't really exist until much later. For centuries, two sleeps was just the way things were. We know this because it shows up everywhere. Medieval diaries, letters, even court documents mention first sleep and second sleep like it's the most ordinary thing in the world. There's one English doctor from the 1500s, Sir Thomas Eliot, who casually wrote about how people should avoid eating between the first and second sleeps. So apparently midnight snacking was a known hazard long before refrigerators existed. French sources call it premier sommeil and second sommeil. Italians use similar phrases. In Chaucer's time, everyone understood what you meant when you said, "after my first sleep." It wasn't poetic. It was just Tuesday. And here's the fun part. Scientists say that this two-sleep pattern isn't just medieval weirdness. It might actually be natural for humans. Studies done in the 1990s by a historian named Roger Eckert, and later by some sleep researchers, found that if you take modern people and cut them off from artificial light, within a few weeks they naturally start falling into this same pattern. They go to bed early, wake up for an hour or two around midnight, then drift back down for a second sleep. Because of course they did. So it wasn't some cultural quirk. It was biology meeting darkness. Basically, before electricity, your body didn't know it was supposed to fake an 8-hour coma. Now, let's imagine that hour or two in the middle of the night. The world is silent, the fire is low. Outside, it's pitch black. No streetlights, no glowing windows, nothing. You'd hear maybe the creak of the house, the shuffle of animals, wind against the thatch. In that half-wakeful space, people described feeling calm, reflective, almost dreamlike. Some would pray. A lot of praying happened. Apparently, the hours between the two sleeps were considered spiritually potent, perfect for whispering a few psalms or having a little existential chat with God. Monks loved this concept. The night vigil hours fit right into the holy schedule because, of course, monks would turn insomnia into a religious discipline. Others used the time more practically. You might get up, check on your livestock, fix a tool, relieve yourself in your charming wooden chamber pot, or chat with whoever else was awake. Couples might use that quiet hour to talk privately, or, well, reconnect. Let's just say medieval writers were very polite about implying that the middle of the night was ideal for marital recreation. If you were wealthy, maybe you'd light a candle and read by the fire. If you were a peasant, you might sit in the dark and think about how expensive candles were. Some households even use the time to visit neighbors, which honestly sounds wild. Imagine someone knocking on your door at 2 a.m. like, "Hey, couldn't sleep, thought I'd stop by." Totally normal back then. Now, what's fascinating is that nobody thought this was weird. The concept of sleeping through the whole night, the way we do now, didn't really exist until much later. For centuries, two sleeps was just the way things were. We know this because it shows up everywhere. Medieval diaries, letters, even court documents mention first sleep and second sleep like it's the most ordinary thing in the world. There's one English doctor from the 1500s, Sir Thomas Eliot, who casually wrote about how people should avoid eating between the first and second sleeps. So apparently midnight snacking was a known hazard long before refrigerators existed. French sources call it premier sommeil and second sommeil. Italians use similar phrases. In Chaucer's time, everyone understood what you meant when you said, "after my first sleep." It wasn't poetic. It was just Tuesday. And here's the fun part. Scientists say that this two-sleep pattern isn't just medieval weirdness. It might actually be natural for humans. Studies done in the 1990s by a historian named Roger Eckert, and later by some sleep researchers, found that if you take modern people and cut them off from artificial light, within a few weeks they naturally start falling into this same pattern. They go to bed early, wake up for an hour or two around midnight, then drift back down for a second sleep. Because of course they did. So it wasn't some cultural quirk. It was biology meeting darkness. Basically, before electricity, your body didn't know it was supposed to fake an 8-hour coma. Now, let's imagine that hour or two in the middle of the night. The world is silent, the fire is low. Outside, it's pitch black. No streetlights, no glowing windows, nothing. You'd hear maybe the creak of the house, the shuffle of animals, wind against the thatch. In that half-wakeful space, people described feeling calm, reflective, almost dreamlike. Some would pray. A lot of praying happened, apparently. The hours between the two sleeps were considered spiritually potent, perfect for whispering a few psalms or having a little existential chat with God. Monks loved this concept. The night vigil hours fit right into the holy schedule because, of course, monks would turn insomnia into a religious discipline. Others use the time more practically. You might get up, check on your livestock, fix a tool, relieve yourself in your charming wooden chamber pot, or chat with whoever else was awake. Couples might use that quiet hour to talk privately, or, well, reconnect. Let's just say medieval writers were very polite about implying that the middle of the night was ideal for marital recreation. If you were wealthy, maybe you'd light a candle and read by the fire. If you were a peasant, you might sit in the dark and think about how expensive candles were. Some households even use the time to visit neighbors, which honestly sounds wild. Imagine someone knocking on your door at 2 a.m. like, "Hey, couldn't sleep, thought I'd stop by." Totally normal back then. Now, this rhythm of life went on for centuries, well into the early modern period. But it started to fade as Europe got brighter. Literally. Once streetlights, candles, and especially oil lamps became cheaper and more common, people stayed up later. Cities glowed. The night became social, not just spooky. Taverns, theaters, and gambling dens all stayed open late, and suddenly going to bed at 8 p.m. was for peasants and grandmas. The rich led the way, of course, because why sleep when you could drink wine and gossip by candlelight? By the 18th century, people were sleeping in one long stretch, and first sleep started sounding old-fashioned. By the 19th, it had almost vanished from memory. Industrialization finished the job. The factory whistle didn't care about your natural circadian rhythm. You got one chance to sleep, and if you missed it, tough luck. But here's the thing. Traces of the old habits stuck around. Some rural areas kept using the phrase first sleep well into the 1800s. And even today, that middle-of-the-night wakefulness, when you suddenly jolt awake for no reason around 2 or 3 a.m., might just be your ancient biology saying, hey, it's the watch hour. Remember me? So next time you wake up in the dark, staring at the ceiling, don't panic. You're not broken. You're just,
Hey there, still awake? Or halfway between consciousness and your own first sleep? Either way, glad you stuck around. We're still drifting softly through the medieval night, where candlelight flickers, shadows crawl across rough plaster walls, and people genuinely believed their dreams were secret messages from the beyond. Because of course they did. You have to remember, this was an era before neuroscience, Freud, or sleep apps that track your REM cycles, but mostly just confirm you're terrible at sleeping. In the medieval mind, if you dreamed something strange, like your neighbor turning into a goat, or your dead uncle offering you soup, that wasn't just brain static. That was a sign, a warning, or, depending on who you asked, maybe even the devil checking in to say hello. So tonight, we'll stay up a little longer and wander through the dream world of the Middle Ages, where sleep wasn't just rest, it was a whole spiritual adventure. First off, medieval people didn't think all dreams were equal. There was a hierarchy, because even their subconscious had to obey the feudal system. They borrowed a lot of their dream theory from the ancient world, especially from Aristotle and a Roman guy named Macrobius, who spent way too much time categorizing nighttime brain nonsense. According to this logic, there were 5 main types of dreams. The visio, the vision, which was supposed to be prophetic, the kind of dream that predicted the future, like dreaming of your cousin's wedding before she even meets the guy. Pretty straightforward. Then there was the somnium, the symbolic dream. That's the one where everything is an allegory. You know, where you dream about a horse with 2 heads, and somehow that's supposed to mean your crops will fail. The oraculum. Dreams where someone, usually a saint or angel, literally drops by to give advice. Kind of like a divine TED Talk in your sleep. Then there was the insomnium, which wasn't prophetic or spiritual at all, just your brain's junk drawer. The stuff that happens when you eat too much cheese before bed and your subconscious starts freestyling. And finally, the visum, the vision that occurs right as you're falling asleep or waking up. Basically what we'd call sleep paralysis or hypnagogic hallucinations today. But back then, people just assumed it was a demon sitting on your chest. Because naturally. That last one, by the way, terrified medieval people. If you ever see old paintings of a person sleeping while a little goblin-like creature crouches on their chest, that's the nightmare. Not just a bad dream, but literally a spirit that caused bad dreams. The word nightmare comes from that idea. Mare being an old word for an evil presence, not a horse, unfortunately. Though let's be honest, a ghost horse sitting on your chest would be equally horrifying. The mare was blamed for all sorts of nocturnal issues, sleep paralysis, panic attacks, maybe even a touch of sleep apnea. Basically, anything uncomfortable that happened while you were unconscious was blamed on supernatural squatters. Some people tried to ward them off by sleeping with iron objects under the pillow or by saying a prayer before bed. Others just accepted that the occasional demonic cuddle session was part of life. Now, because dreams were considered messages from God, angels, or, inconveniently, the devil, Interpreting them became a serious business. There were dream manuals, whole books that told you what it meant if you dreamed of, say, a fish or a burning tower or your teeth falling out. Spoiler, none of it meant good things. Dreams about water? That could symbolize sin. Dreams of fire? Temptation. Losing teeth? Death, of course. Always death. Basically, if you dreamed about anything remotely odd, congratulations. You were either being warned by heaven or hunted by hell. Sleep tight. Even the royals got caught up into it. Take, for instance, Henry I of England, who, according to chroniclers, once dreamed that his castle's walls were crumbling and his crown was slipping into the sea. Everyone around him agreed this was obviously a divine omen. Spoiler, a few years later, his only legitimate son drowned in the White Ship disaster. So that one didn't help him sleep any better. Medieval rulers loved using dreams as political proof, too. If you wanted to justify a war, a coronation, or a convenient divine decision, all you had to do was claim you dreamed about it. God told me in my sleep was basically the medieval version of I have sources. Joan of Arc, famously, claimed to hear divine voices and see visions that told her to lead France to victory. Her judges later used those same visions against her, arguing that if she dreamed while female and confident, it could only mean witchcraft. So really, dreaming was a high-risk activity. Now, everyday people weren't excluded from all this. In village life, dreams were a part of gossip. Someone would wake up, tell their friends about what they saw, and everyone would nod sagely like, "Ah, yes, that means your cousin is about to get sick," or "better not plant peas this week." There were even local wise women, basically unofficial dream analysts, who'd interpret what your subconscious was trying to say, usually for a small payment in eggs, ale, or, gratitude. It's funny to think about. The medieval equivalent of astrology TikTok, just more damp and less glittery. One interesting detail, medieval medicine actually connected dreams to digestion. Physicians back then were obsessed with the idea of humors. The four bodily fluids, blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, that supposedly controlled everything about you, including your personality and your dreams. If you ate too heavily before bed, or if your humors were unbalanced, it was thought your stomach's vapors would rise up to your brain and cause strange dreams. So yes, the next time you have a weird dream after midnight pizza, you can rest easy knowing you're just following a 1,000-year-old medical tradition. But not all dreams were ominous. Some were considered healing, even sacred. Pilgrims would sometimes sleep overnight in churches or shrines, hoping to receive a vision from a saint. This was called incubation, not in the egg sense, but the soak in holiness overnight and wait for a message sense. Saints were believed to appear in dreams to give cures, advice, or comfort. Sometimes they'd even prescribe specific remedies, like drink from this well 3 times and you'll be fine, which, depending on the well, could either save you or give you dysentery. Of course, the church had mixed feelings about all this. Some priests accepted dreams as potential divine messages, as long as they involved saints and pious themes. But others warned that dreams were dangerous, a gateway for the devil to whisper lies. It didn't help that some of the more vivid dreams people described involved very non-saintly content. Let's just say there were reasons monks were told not to dwell too long on their nocturnal imaginations. Still, dream interpretation persisted. It was too ingrained in everyday life to disappear. Even theologians like Thomas Aquinas weighed in, explaining that dreams could come from God, nature, or demons, depending on what mood your soul was in. So basically, if you dreamed something good, thank God. If it was weird, blame your dinner. If it was terrifying, call a priest. What's interesting is how modern this all feels, in a strange way. We still do it, right?
wake up from a bizarre dream and immediately try to assign it meaning. We Google, what does it mean if you dream of teeth falling out? And hope for something poetic instead of anxiety. Maybe deep down, we like to think our dreams still have purpose, that they're a message, not just brain noise. The medieval world just took that impulse and turned it into an entire nightly philosophy. Now, let's tie it back to our two sleeps. That middle period between them, the watch, was when people often reflected on their dreams from the first sleep. They would sit quietly, half awake, mulling over what they saw. Maybe they'd even jot it down or talk about it with whoever else had woken up. It was like a communal therapy session, but lit by a single candle and occasionally interrupted by chickens. Dreams weren't private. They were part of your moral and spiritual life, shared and examined, like confession. The night was long, and people used it to think, feel, and make sense of their world. That's something kind of beautiful, really. This slow, layered rhythm of sleep, waking, reflection, and sleep again. A night full of movement, not absence. But before we drift back to our second sleep, let's quietly move on to something else that filled those medieval nights. Because if dreams were the imagination's playground, there was another side of nighttime that was a little less wholesome, full of ghost stories, wandering spirits, and the kind of folklore that made people double bolt their doors. Let's float over there next, to the strange, sleepy world of medieval night terrors, witch flights, and bedtime superstitions.
Hey there! Welcome back to the quiet hours. The candle's still flickering, the wind is softly clawing at the shutters, and somewhere in the rafters, a rat is doing parkour. We've talked about medieval people's two sleeps and their very busy dream lives. But before you drift into your own second sleep, let's peek into another corner of the night, the one full of strange sounds, ghostly rumors, and general superstition. Because while modern people fear not getting enough REM sleep, medieval folks were more worried about being dragged out of bed by invisible forces, which, honestly, fair enough. Let's start with this. Nighttime in the Middle Ages wasn't cozy. It was alive, but in all the wrong ways. No electricity, no streetlights, just moonlight, mist, and imagination. Every creak of the timber frame, every dog bark, every owl hoot carried a story. And those stories almost always involved ghosts. Medieval people didn't really have a category for random noises. Everything had meaning. So if your door rattled at night, that wasn't the wind. That was someone or something trying to get in. And since heaven, hell, and purgatory were considered real estate options, most assumed the dead had a few visitation rights. Ghosts, or revenants as they were often called, weren't transparent, floaty things. They were meatier. Imagine a slightly decomposed cousin showing up at your door because he forgot to finish repenting. In medieval ghost stories, the dead were solid. They smelled bad. They sometimes attacked people. These weren't friendly, glowing Casper types. These were full-on guilt zombies, wandering the night because they still had moral paperwork to file. One 12th century chronicler named William of Newburgh, a man who sounded permanently unimpressed with humanity, wrote several such tales. In one, a man from Yorkshire rose from his grave every night to stalk the streets, dripping rot, terrifying dogs, and giving people contagious fear. When the townsfolk finally dug him up, they found his body fresh and bloated, blood smeared around his mouth. Naturally, they decapitated him and burned the remains, because that's the medieval version of customer support. These stories weren't just campfire tales. People genuinely believed them, and believed they explained real problems. Cattle dying mysteriously must be a restless spirit. Neighbor got sick overnight, definitely a ghost. your candle keeps going out, purgatory's open mic night, obviously. Monks and priests even had rituals for dealing with revenants. They'd bless the grave, sprinkle holy water, or hold mass for the deceased. Sometimes they'd dig the body up to settle it properly. Because, nothing says peace like a shovel. Then there were the night witches, and this is where things get extra strange. Before the witch trials of the early modern era turned witchcraft into a full-blown moral panic, the medieval version was more hazy. Witches weren't necessarily your cackling broom riders yet. They were often described as women who could leave their bodies at night, fly invisibly, and meet with spirits or demons under the cover of darkness. Sometimes they were blamed for riding men in their sleep, an experience later called the old hag or nightmare. Again, this probably came from sleep paralysis, but since nobody in 1300 had a neurology degree, demons sitting on your chest was the default explanation. In fact, the Latin word incubus for a male demon that visited women literally means one who lies upon, which, yes, is deeply uncomfortable in every sense. People thought these entities could cause illness, infertility, or just plain exhaustion. And of course, since women were easier to blame for things, a time-honored tradition, the suspicion usually fell on widows, herbalists, or anyone who owned too many cats. But it wasn't all demons and witches. Some night creatures were more folkloric. In English countryside lore, there were will-o'-the-wisps, flickering lights that appeared in marshes, said to be spirits luring travelers to their doom. Scientists today say it's swamp gas igniting spontaneously, but medieval people didn't need chemistry. They had imagination. Then there were the bar guests, ghostly black dogs with glowing eyes that prowled roads at night. If you saw one, it meant someone nearby would die soon. Basically, the original spoiler alert. Other places had their own mascots of terror. In Germany, the Nachseher, a corpse that chewed its own shroud in the grave. In Slavic lands, the vampire. Yes, the prototype vampire, who left its coffin to snack on relatives. And in Ireland, the banshee, a wailing female spirit whose cries foretold death in noble families. Which all meant that the night wasn't just dark, it was crowded. Now, how do people deal with all this? Simple. Rituals, charms, and general paranoia. Before bed, it was common to recite protective prayers. The Wait Paternoster was a favorite, basically a bedtime incantation disguised as a prayer. People would also hang herbs like rue or St. John's wort near the bed, or place iron tools, scissors, knives, horseshoes by the door. Iron apparently offended evil spirits. It also rusted, but we'll let that slide. If you were extra nervous, you might draw a small cross on your pillow with holy water. Or if you were too poor for that, spit over your left shoulder and hope for the best. And of course, candles. Everyone knew that blowing out a candle too quickly could invite darkness, literally and spiritually. So you snuffed it slowly, respectfully, as if saying, "Please don't haunt me, I'm just trying to save on wax." And even the architecture reflected these fears. Thatched roofed cottages often had protective symbols carved over doorways, little sun wheels or crosses meant to ward off evil. And those weird witch windows you sometimes see in old houses, tilted diagonally, supposedly witches couldn't fly through them, because apparently demons struggled with geometry. Some towns even had curfews, literal bells that rang each evening reminding everyone to cover the fire and stay indoors. The French phrase couvre-feu, cover fire, eventually became our word curfew. So the next time your phone tells you it's bedtime, you can think centuries of fear-driven fire safety. Of course, the church tried to keep a lid on all this folklore. Officially, Only God, saints, or demons could affect the living. Ghostly grandpas and marsh spirits didn't fit neatly into doctrine. But people are people. You can hand them a Bible and they'll still believe in whatever knocks after midnight. So the church compromised. If someone saw a ghost, priests might explain it as a soul from purgatory seeking prayers. That way it stayed theological, not superstitious. The ghost wasn't haunting you, it just needed paperwork. You could even help, light candles, say masses, and maybe, eventually, the restless spirit would move on. Medieval mutual aid for the dead. Then, of course, there were nightmares, in the literal, spiritual sense. People genuinely feared going to bed angry, unconfessed, or sinful. You could die in your sleep and wake up in the wrong afterlife. There are letters where people confess to feeling terrified before bed, unsure if they'd open their eyes again at dawn. So bedtime wasn't just rest. It was a mini rehearsal for death. You laid down, closed your eyes, and hoped to wake up, both literally and spiritually, which explains why so many prayers start with, "If I die before I wake." And yet, for all their fear, there's something strangely peaceful about how they treated the night. It wasn't the enemy, just another realm, one where the living, the dead, and the divine all shared space for a few quiet hours. Between the first and second sleeps, between prayers and dreams, people lived in that gentle uncertainty, never sure what was real, but always sure it meant something. And maybe that's what we've lost. Today the night is bright and busy. We fill it with screens and noise. We don't give ourselves time to sit with silence, or listen to the house creak and imagine who might be listening back. For the medieval mind, every sound had a story. Every shadow had a soul. And whether it was a restless ghost, a wandering witch, or just the neighbor's pig rooting outside, it was part of the rhythm of the night. So as our candle burns low and the last bit of wax pools quietly in its dish, maybe it's time to take a slow breath, hold the blanket close, and remember you're sharing a very old human ritual. The dark has always been there. So have we. Now, let's drift toward the second sleep.
The candle's still burning low, and we're finally ready to talk about the place where all of this actually happened, the bed itself. Now, you might imagine some grand carved wooden four-poster from a costume drama, silk sheets, embroidered curtains, maybe a lute player softly strumming nearby. Yeah, no. Most medieval people slept in something closer to a hay bale with ambition. Let's slip under the covers, metaphorically please, and take a quiet look at how the Middle Ages really slept. So first things first, beds were not standard. They were social status on four legs. If you were poor, your bed was probably a sack stuffed with straw, reeds, or, if you were really living the dream, feathers. They called this a palliasse, which sounds fancy until you remember it's basically a medieval air mattress without the air. And you didn't get your own either. Privacy was a luxury most people couldn't afford. Families, parents, children, sometimes servants, all slept together in the same space, often in the same bed or right next to one another on the floor. Not because they were overly sentimental, but because heating a house in 1300 was not really a thing. Body heat was the central heating system. So yes, medieval sleep was communal, cramped, and occasionally awkward. In fact, the average peasant home was basically one big multi-purpose room. You cooked there, ate there, stored tools there, and at the end of the day, just kind of collapsed in whatever spot wasn't occupied by livestock. Animals sometimes slept indoors too. Chickens, goats, maybe even the family pig. It wasn't a farmyard mistake. It was insulation. You take what warmth you can get. So if you woke up at midnight during your watch, it wasn't just you and the candle. It was you, your spouse, two kids, a pig, and a cow giving you side-eye. The whole ecosystem of medieval life tucked under one leaky roof. Romantic, in a vaguely unhygienic way. Now, if you moved up the social ladder a bit, say into the realm of tradesmen or small landowners, things got fancier. Beds might be raised off the ground to keep away drafts, and rats, supported by a wooden frame with ropes strung across it. Those ropes held up the mattress, which over time sagged terribly, hence the old phrase, sleep tight. It meant literally tightening the bed ropes before sleeping, not tucking in your emotional issues. The bedding itself would include linen sheets if you could afford them, a woolen blanket or two, and maybe a coverlet made of animal skins. No duvets yet. Those come much later. If you wanted softness, you just added more layers and hoped no one stole them. But let's be honest. The people with truly interesting beds were the nobility. If you were rich in the Middle Ages, your bed wasn't just a piece of furniture. It was a status symbol, a throne you could drool on. Beds in castles were enormous, tall, canopied, curtained, and often so heavy you'd need a small workforce to move them. They weren't just for sleeping either. The bedchamber was a semi-public space, especially for royals. Ambassadors, servants, and courtiers might attend you there. The bed was a backdrop for diplomacy, gossip, even small audiences. Imagine signing a treaty while your monarch is half reclining on embroidered pillows. That was normal. And the curtains? Those weren't just for romance. They helped trap warmth, which in an unheated stone room was the difference between royal comfort and majestic frostbite. Speaking of warmth, let's talk about nightwear. Spoiler, there wasn't much of it. Most people just slept in their undergarments or in whatever tunic they'd been wearing that day. Pajamas, as we know them, weren't really a thing. The wealthy might have a specific nightshirt, a long, loose linen garment, but for everyone else, going to bed was less about fashion and more about survival. You didn't want to strip down too much in a drafty room because medieval architecture was basically a sieve, and bathing was infrequent. So that nightshirt, it was doing double duty. Now, as for who shared the bed, that depended entirely on your class, gender, and marital status. For commoners, sharing beds was completely normal, not just with family, but with guests or travelers too. Inns didn't have private rooms. If you stopped at a tavern for the night, you'd likely end up sleeping beside one or two strangers. It wasn't weird. It was efficient. Beds were expensive, and warmth was communal. You'd just climb in, mutter a polite goodnight, and do your best to ignore the snoring. Medieval hospitality was deeply practical that way. Even some university students and apprentices were expected to share beds in dormitory-style arrangements. There are even surviving letters from medieval parents advising their sons to mind their manners when sharing beds, which sounds vague and probably for good reason. For nobles and royals, of course, things got more ceremonial. Marriage beds were important social objects. They symbolized alliances, heirs, and dynasties. The wedding night wasn't always private either. Witnesses, usually attendants or priests, would sometimes observe the couple being put to bed to confirm the marriage was official. Romantic, right? Nothing says true love than your in-laws watching you climb under the sheets. After that, though, noble couples often didn't sleep together regularly. They had separate chambers or even separate wings, especially in large castles. Practical reasons mostly, servants bustling in and out, different schedules, and the sheer number of people involved in maintaining royal dignity at all hours. So when they did share a bed, it was intentional, usually for making heirs, or gossiping, or both. Beds also had symbolic power in death. People were often described as taking to their bed in their final days, surrounded by family, priests, and a growing number of relics and candles. The bed became a sort of threshold between life and afterlife, comfort and eternity. Many wills included specific bequests for the bed or the bedding. To my daughter, the red coverlet with the silver fringe, that sort of thing. Because in a world where material goods were precious, even your last nap had an inventory. Now, we can't talk about medieval sleep without mentioning bedbugs. Yes, they existed, and yes, they thrived. With straw mattresses, infrequent washing, and limited pest control, infestations were common. People sprinkled herbs like lavender or wormwood in their bedding to deter insects. It probably helped a little, or at least smelled nicer. There are also references to hanging mattresses outside to air out and beat away the bugs, which sounds cathartic if nothing else. So the next time you complain about your fitted sheet coming loose, remember, at least it's not alive. One of the most charming aspects of medieval sleep culture, though, was the idea of bed fellowship, the quiet intimacy of sharing warmth and space. It wasn't always romantic. Sometimes it was friendship, or kinship, or just survival. But it created a bond, something gentle in a world that wasn't always kind. Letters from the 15th century show people reminiscing fondly about the good nights we shared one bed together, meaning companionship, not scandal. Sleep, in a sense, was social glue. Maybe that's something we've lost in our era of separate rooms and glowing phones, the human closeness of the dark. And of course, there were always rules because nothing in medieval life was free from moral commentary. Priests and moralists wrote endlessly about chaste sleeping. Married couples were advised to sleep separately during Lent or other holy periods. Some monks even kept logs of temptations in sleep, as if God had a nightly audit system. But beneath all the rules, the truth was simple. People just wanted to rest. They worked from sunrise to sunset, lived through hunger and cold, and when night came, they curled up together under whatever they had, listening to the fire crackle and the wind whisper through the thatch. 2 sleeps, a few dreams, maybe a ghost or two. And somehow they made it through the centuries. As the candle burns to its stub and we tuck our metaphorical blankets around us, we can almost hear the quiet rhythm of their lives. First sleep, wakefulness, second sleep. Each night a small ritual of survival, of warmth, faith, and shared humanity. So as you drift now, somewhere between waking and dreaming, remember, the night was never just darkness to them. It was a whole world. And with that, maybe...
Welcome back, Night Wanderer. If you're still awake, congratulations. You've outlasted the medieval rooster, the candle stub, and about 600 years of history. Now we're slowly drifting out of the Middle Ages into a new world, one full of chimneys, clocks, and the gentle hum of industrial misery. Yes, tonight we leave behind the flicker of the hearth and step into the era that killed the medieval 2 sleeps, and ironically, also the one that made us all way more tired. So, let's set the scene. It's the 1700s, and the world is changing faster than you can say, spinning Jenny. Cities are growing, candles are replaced by oil lamps, and soon, lamps are replaced by gaslight, which sounds glamorous, but mostly meant people could now stay up late enough to be even more exhausted the next day. The night, once long and full of natural darkness,
was now lit up like a Christmas tree designed by someone who hated circadian rhythms. And as the night shrank, so too did that quiet space between sleeps, that peaceful midnight intermission when people once woke naturally, prayed, talked, or just existed. Now, there was no pause, just one long, unbroken stretch of fatigue. Progress. You see, industrialization didn't just give us machines, it gave us time discipline. Before this, people worked with the sun. You got up when it rose, slept when it set, and if you woke up in the middle of the night, well, you made use of it. But once factories started running, they ran on clocks. Not on seasons, not on daylight, on rigid mechanical hours. And when your shift started at 6 a.m. sharp, no one cared if you were in the middle of your first sleep. You needed one consolidated block of rest, and it had to fit the schedule. So, like obedient little humans, we adapted. The old 2 sleeps quietly disappeared, not because we chose to, but because the rhythm of society changed around us. Artificial lighting played a huge role too. Gaslight first, then electric bulbs, they stretched the day into the night, slowly erasing the boundary between the two. By the 19th century, people could work, read, or socialize long past sunset. The hours once meant for first sleep became hours for productivity. Because why rest when you can invent new ways to overwork yourself? And once bedtime moved later, there simply wasn't enough darkness left to split it into 2. So we started cramming all our sleep into one continuous block. A full night's rest, we called it. But deep down, our biology never quite got the memo. Because here's the thing. Modern sleep scientists have found that our bodies still carry the echoes of those medieval rhythms. If you put someone in complete darkness for long enough, no clocks, no lights, no Netflix, they naturally revert to segmented sleep. About 4 hours, then a calm period of wakefulness, then another 4 hours. It's like a whisper from the past, a built-in reminder that we weren't designed for the nonstop electric world we've built. So, if you find yourself waking up at 2 a.m., staring at the ceiling, wondering why your brain hates you, congratulations. You're just being historically authentic. And speaking of authenticity, let's talk about how people felt when this shift happened. Surprisingly, many missed the old ways. Writers and thinkers of the 18th and 19th centuries sometimes described modern sleep as restless, unsatisfying, a single heavy slumber that left them groggy and uninspired. They longed for the calm hours between sleeps, when the mind wandered gently through ideas and dreams. That half-conscious stillness was fertile ground for creativity and prayer. And once it was gone, something subtle disappeared with it. The poet Thomas Browne once called the night the mother of thoughts. But in the age of factories and deadlines, there was less and less room for her children. Now, not everyone adjusted smoothly. Doctors in the 19th century began to notice a rise in insomnia, a word that barely existed before. People were staying up later, drinking more coffee, working longer hours, and then lying awake, anxious that they couldn't fall asleep. Sound familiar? It turns out the Industrial Revolution didn't just change our work, it colonized our dreams, and the new anxiety about sleep, the idea that we must sleep solidly for 8 hours or something is wrong, that's a completely modern invention. Our medieval ancestors would have found it strange. Waking at night wasn't insomnia to them, it was just night. They'd light a candle, talk quietly, maybe say a few prayers, and drift back when ready. No panic, no productivity guilt, no melatonin gummies. By the late 1800s, the two-sleep system was basically extinct in the West. Urbanization had finished the job. In the new industrial cities, noise, light, and rigid timetables made segmented sleep nearly impossible. Even rural areas began to adopt single sleep patterns, following the social rhythm of the towns. And so, in less than a century, we lost a habit that had shaped human nights for thousands of years. The great natural intermission of the night faded quietly into history, like candlelight swallowed by gas flame. Of course, modern science keeps circling back to the idea, like a cat pawing at a closed door. Researchers studying circadian rhythms have found that biphasic sleep, that's the fancy term, might actually be healthier for some people. It aligns more closely with our biological cycles, reduces stress hormones, and gives the brain a chance to process memories in stages. Some modern experiments even mimic the medieval night, 2 short sleeps with a gentle hour of wakefulness in between. And people report feeling calmer, more creative, less pressured. Not bad for an idea we abandoned because we wanted to build railroads. Now, to be clear, I'm not suggesting we all go back to sleeping on straw mats, waking up at 1 a.m. to whisper psalms, though honestly, it might beat scrolling through social media until our souls melt. But maybe there's a lesson here. Maybe the medieval world, in all its smoky, drafty chaos, knew something about balance we've forgotten. They accepted the rhythm of the night instead of fighting it. They listened to their bodies, and we, with our caffeine, our screens, and our 24-hour convenience, keep wondering why we're so tired all the time. It's not that we're sleeping less. It's that we've lost the space around sleep, the silence between the two halves. So, next time you wake up in the dark, don't panic, don't grab your phone, just breathe. Think of a quiet cottage, a candle guttering in the corner, someone stirring the embers to life. You're not broken. You're just a medieval sleeper in a modern world. And maybe, just maybe, if we all learn to respect that rhythm again, we might finally stop being a civilization running permanently on low battery. As we close our long wander through the night, from the monasteries of Europe to the mills of Manchester, let's take one last sleepy look back. Once, the night was divided. It had a shape, a breath, a heartbeat. First sleep, a dream, a moment of quiet wakefulness. Second sleep, the pulse of human rest, beating softly beneath centuries of change. We've forgotten it, but it hasn't forgotten us. And maybe tonight, when you drift off and wake again in the hush of darkness, you'll feel that ancient rhythm whispering just under the surface. 2 sleeps, 1 night, and 1,000 years of dreams in between.
You've survived medieval bedbugs, candle smoke, and the Industrial Revolution, which is honestly more than most 19th century factory workers could say. Now, let's ease into the quieter part of our story, the part where modern science meets the ghosts of the past, and where we start realizing that maybe, just maybe, our ancestors weren't so wrong after all. So take a breath, pull your blanket closer. The night isn't over yet. It's funny, isn't it? For most of human history, sleeping twice a night was normal, expected even. Then, for a brief few centuries, we decided that was weird, and now we're rediscovering it all over again. Sleep scientists have spent the last few decades studying patterns that look suspiciously like what medieval people did naturally. Turns out our brains are still wired for it. If you cut someone off from modern light,
No phones, no LEDs, no caffeine-fueled Netflix marathons, and let them live with only natural daylight for a few weeks, something strange happens. They start sleeping in two parts, just like the peasants and monks of old Europe. This was first noticed in the 1990s by a researcher named Thomas Weir, who ran a simple but telling experiment. He put volunteers in complete darkness for 14 hours a day, about what medieval winter nights would have felt like. At first, everyone just slept a lot, catching up on their modern exhaustion. But after a few days, their sleep naturally split into two halves, about 4 hours each, with 1 or 2 hours of peaceful wakefulness in between. They weren't restless, they weren't anxious, they were calm. They described the in-between period as serene, even meditative. Their brains showed higher levels of prolactin, a hormone that encourages relaxation and emotional bonding. In other words, their bodies remembered. The two sleeps weren't an odd historical quirk, they were our default setting. So what happened when we gave that up? Well, we got busier, of course, more productive, but also more anxious, more tired, more chemically dependent on caffeine, and more likely to fall asleep with a glowing rectangle inches from our face. Progress comes with side effects, and one of them is chronic exhaustion. You can't trick biology forever, and our modern obsession with squeezing all our rest into one tight 8-hour box doesn't always work, especially when our brains still expect a pause in the middle. That 3 a.m. wake up, that's not insomnia. That's your medieval wiring politely knocking. We even see traces of it in language and literature. Old texts often mention the first sleep and the second sleep, like everyone knows what that means, because they did, even into the 17th and 18th centuries. Diary entries and letters mention after first sleep, before second sleep, or simply in the waking. It wasn't some mystical event, it was Tuesday. One 15th century French doctor even prescribed certain medicines to be taken after the first sleep, the medical equivalent of take with food. So when we read about people wandering their houses at night, praying, thinking, or just sitting quietly, that wasn't insomnia either. That was life. In fact, some historians think the middle of the night might have been one of the most creative times in the medieval world. When the world was silent and the fires still glowed faintly, people's minds could wander freely. Writers composed poetry, monks meditated, farmers mended tools, lovers whispered. It wasn't waking up, it was another kind of dreaming. Today, we call that midnight anxiety. Back then, it was just the night's intermission. And here's the wild part. Modern sleep therapy sometimes tries to bring this rhythm back. Doctors treating certain types of insomnia have experimented with biphasic sleep schedules, encouraging people to rest early, wake briefly in the night, and then sleep again. Some patients report feeling more rested afterward than with continuous sleep. Their dreams become more vivid, their anxiety drops. It's not a cure-all, of course, but it's a quiet reminder that maybe our ancestors knew something instinctively that we've intellectualized away. Sometimes rest isn't about shutting down. It's about listening to the rhythm. Let's pause for a moment and think about that rhythm, the pulse of light and dark, day and night. Before electricity, before screens, even before firelight, the world itself dictated our cycles. We rose with dawn, we rested with dusk, and in that long, dark middle stretch, we drifted in and out of sleep, half in the world, half in dreams.
There's something almost sacred about that. The shared quiet of generations who lived and slept by the same stars. Now, the night never really comes. Our lights are always on. And so our rest, our real rest, never quite arrives. Sleep scientists sometimes talk about sleep pressure, the buildup of chemicals in the brain that make you tired. But there's also something softer at play, a psychological pressure, a need for pause, not just unconsciousness. The watch between sleeps was that pause. It gave people time to be awake without being productive. Think about that. An hour or two of wakefulness where no one expected you to do anything. Not work, not talk, not even move much. Just exist. We've almost erased that now, and we wonder why we're burned out. And maybe that's why we're all obsessed with recreating it in tiny ways. The quiet midnight scroll, the 2 a.m. journal entry, the gentle hum of white noise. We're chasing a ghost, the ghost of the second sleep. Even our sleep apps with their gentle wake cycles and relaxation modes are trying to patch over something our ancestors had built into their lives. But the truth is, you can't app your way back to natural rest. You can only surrender to it. So maybe the lesson isn't that we should all go medieval again. It's that the night doesn't have to be the enemy. If you wake up in the dark, you're not broken. You're human. Your body remembers a time when that was normal, when silence wasn't something to be filled, but something to be shared. So maybe when that moment comes, when the world feels still and your thoughts start wandering, don't fight it. Light a candle in your mind. Let the quiet do its work. Because somewhere, centuries ago, someone else was awake too, sitting by a small fire, listening to the same wind, between first sleep and second. And in that shared moment, across time, across darkness, we're not so different after all.
If you're hearing this, it's probably well past midnight, the quiet hour when reality gets a little softer around the edges. So let's stay there, right in that dim, candle flicker space. Tonight, we'll wander through the dreams and night fears of the medieval world, the time when sleep wasn't just rest. It was revelation, terror, and sometimes a visit from the divine. Because to the medieval mind, night wasn't empty, it was alive. Let's start with something simple. Dreams. To us, dreams are strange little movies our brains make while doing maintenance. Random, meaningless, occasionally embarrassing. But in the Middle Ages, dreams weren't just dreams. They were messages, sometimes from God, sometimes from the devil, sometimes from last night's questionable stew. People believed sleep opened a door between worlds. The soul could wander, angels could whisper, demons could meddle, and saints could show up uninvited with moral advice. It was the original inbox, and nobody had spam filters. In fact, dream interpretation was practically a science, or at least what passed for science when half your library was chained to a wall. Monks studied dream manuals, many of them based on ancient Greek texts by writers like Artemidorus, the ancient dream guy, not a Harry Potter character, unfortunately. They believed every dream symbol meant something. A river might symbolize desire, a ladder meant ambition or spiritual ascent. Teeth falling out, well, apparently that one's been bad news since forever. But in the medieval imagination, dreams weren't just psychological, they were spiritual. Your nighttime thoughts could be a message from heaven or a test from hell, which made waking up at 2 a.m. between your first and second sleep a little more complicated than it is now. Let's float over to a dim monastery cell. A monk lies awake between sleeps. He's had a dream of light or fire or a voice whispering something half understood. He writes it down carefully, then prays for clarity. Maybe it was God, maybe temptation. Either way, it's worth noting. Monks, you see, kept detailed dream diaries. They treated the mind's wanderings as moral evidence, clues about their inner purity. If your dreams were full of temptation or fear, it meant your soul was restless. If they were peaceful and bright, you were probably doing fine with your vows. It's a little like therapy, but with more incense. For ordinary people, dreams were often practical, omens for crops, illness, or love. A dream of rain might mean good harvests. A dream of snakes, betrayal. A dream of your dead relatives, well, that could go either way, depending on how talkative they were. Some people believed the dead could visit through dreams, offering advice or warnings, which makes sense in a world where the line between the living and the afterlife was as thin as a blanket in winter. And then there were the nightmares. The word itself comes from the Old English mare, a kind of spirit or demon that sat on your chest while you slept, crushing your breath and filling your dreams with fear. People across Europe believed in them. Germany had the Alp, Scandinavia had the Mara, France had the Kashmar. Always the same story. Something invisible pressing on your chest in the dark, pinning you down, stealing your air. Today we call it sleep paralysis, but to a medieval sleeper, it was an attack, a real visitation. They'd wake terrified, half paralyzed, convinced that something evil had crept into their room. And honestly, with the wind howling through the thatch and rats skittering in the walls, you can't blame them. The night could feel personal. It's almost poetic, really. They lived surrounded by darkness, literal, spiritual, emotional. And so their fears took shape in the dark. Nightmares weren't just dreams, they were battles. Moral, physical, sometimes even theological. You didn't just wake up sweating. You woke up wondering if you'd survived an encounter with the devil himself. It wasn't an anxiety disorder. It was spiritual warfare, and it happened right in your bed. And yet, dreams could also bring comfort. Saints and angels appeared to people in their sleep, offering guidance or reassurance. There's a famous story of Saint Patrick, who was once a slave in Ireland. He dreamt that God told him to flee. So he did. That dream changed his entire life, and by extension, Irish history. Many kings claimed divine dreams too, sometimes conveniently, right before making big political decisions. If you're going to invade France, it helps to say an angel told you to.
Hey there, dream wanderer. Still with me? Good. Let's stay soft and slow for this one. Because this is the part of the story where the world starts to wake up. Permanently. The long, dark rhythm of medieval nights begins to break. And people start forgetting what it meant to sleep twice. It didn't happen overnight, of course. That would have been too poetic even for history. But across the centuries, little things, small, glowing, ticking, and steaming things, quietly killed the two sleeps. Let's start with the first culprit, light. For most of human history, light was expensive. Candles were made from beeswax if you were rich, and tallow, animal fat, if you weren't. The poor stuff stank when it burned. You didn't waste it unless you really needed to. So night meant darkness, full stop. But then came cheap light. Better candle making, oil lamps, glass windows. Small innovations that, together, extended the day. You could work later, read later, pray later, gossip later. And that changed everything. Because when you stop going to bed right after sunset, your natural 2-sleep pattern starts to slip. You stay up later, wake later, and before long, that middle of the night waking period vanishes. One long sleep replaces 2. Quietly, almost without notice. By the 1600s, Europe had discovered coffee, the drink that single-handedly murdered the medieval night. Coffee houses spread like wildfire, first in the Ottoman Empire, then Venice, London, Paris. They were bright, buzzy, caffeinated hubs of thought and gossip. People started staying up late to talk, write, and argue about philosophy, science, or, more likely, their neighbor's terrible wig. This was the age of enlightenment, after all. And you can't enlighten anyone if you're asleep. Then came clocks. Mechanical, precise, relentless. For the first time, people had a way to measure their hours, not by the sun, but by the tick. And that tick started to rule their lives. It told them when to work, when to pray, when to eat, and, of course, when to wake up. The night stopped being a natural rhythm and became a schedule. And under that schedule, there wasn't much room for a first sleep and second sleep anymore. You were expected to get one, efficient, continuous, and ideally short, so you could get back to work. You can almost hear the medieval sleeper protesting. What do you mean 8 hours straight? That's absurd. What about my midnight prayers, my fire stirring, my neighbor's chickens? But the world had changed. Cities were louder, nights were brighter, clocks were stricter. Even the stars got harder to see. And as the light grew, the old night, the deep, spiritual, wandering night, faded. Let's float into a 17th century London street. The air smells like coal smoke and roasted coffee. It's midnight, but the city is alive. Windows glow, horses clatter. Somewhere, a writer is hunched over a candle scribbling something that will make him famous long after he's dead. And down the street, a coffee house hums, full of merchants, scholars, and sailors, all arguing over news from the colonies. No one's thinking about first sleep or second sleep. They're too busy living in the in-between. This is what we call progress. But really, it's just insomnia with better lighting. By the 18th century, the idea of segmented sleep was fading fast. Medical books stopped mentioning it. People began describing normal sleep as something continuous, an unbroken stretch of rest. The old rhythm survived in the countryside for a while, especially among farmers and servants. But in the cities, it was gone. The Industrial Revolution sealed the deal. Factories demanded workers to show up on time, stay alert, and follow schedules set by machines. Midnight was no longer a time for quiet reflection or prayer. It was for sleeping, efficiently, completely, and only once. You can almost hear the medieval sleeper protesting. What do you mean 8 hours straight? That's absurd. What about my midnight prayers, my fire stirring, my neighbor's chickens? But the world had changed. Cities were louder, nights were brighter, clocks were stricter. Even the stars got harder to see. And as the light grew, the old night, the deep, spiritual, wandering night, faded. Let's float into a 17th century London street. The air smells like coal smoke and roasted coffee. It's midnight, but the city is alive. Windows glow, horses clatter. Somewhere, a writer is hunched over a candle scribbling something that will make him famous long after he's dead. And down the street, a coffee house hums, full of merchants, scholars, and sailors, all arguing over news from the colonies. No one's thinking about first sleep or second sleep. They're too busy living in the in-between. This is what we call progress. But really, it's just insomnia with better lighting. By the 18th century, the idea of segmented sleep was fading fast. Medical books stopped mentioning it. People began describing normal sleep as something continuous, an unbroken stretch of rest. The old rhythm survived in the countryside for a while, especially among farmers and servants. But in the cities, it was gone. The Industrial Revolution sealed the deal. Factories demanded workers to show up on time, stay alert, and follow schedules set by machines. Midnight was no longer a time for quiet reflection or prayer. It was for sleeping, efficiently, completely, and only once. You can almost hear the medieval sleeper protesting. What do you mean 8 hours straight? That's absurd. What about my midnight prayers, my fire stirring, my neighbor's chickens? But the world had changed. Cities were louder, nights were brighter, clocks were stricter. Even the stars got harder to see. And as the light grew, the old night, the deep, spiritual, wandering night, faded. Let's float into a 17th century London street. The air smells like coal smoke and roasted coffee. It's midnight, but the city is alive. Windows glow, horses clatter. Somewhere, a writer's hunched over a candle scribbling something that will make him famous long after he's dead. And down the street, a coffee house hums, full of merchants, scholars, and sailors, all arguing over news from the colonies. No one's thinking about first sleep or second sleep. They're too busy living in the in-between. This is what we call progress. But really, it's just insomnia with better lighting. By the 18th century, the idea of segmented sleep was fading fast. Medical books stopped mentioning it. People began describing normal sleep as something continuous, an unbroken stretch of rest. The old rhythm survived in the countryside for a while, especially among farmers and servants. But in the cities, it was gone. The Industrial Revolution sealed the deal. Factories demanded workers to show up on time, stay alert, and follow schedules set by machines. Midnight was no longer a time for quiet reflection or prayer. It was for sleeping, efficiently, completely, and only once. You can almost hear the medieval sleeper protesting. What do you mean 8 hours straight? That's absurd. What about my midnight prayers, my fire stirring, my neighbor's chickens? But the world had changed. Nights were brighter, and clocks were stricter. Even the stars got harder to see. And as the light grew, the old night, you've made it all the way to the end, which, fittingly, feels a lot like the beginning. That quiet, between worlds feeling where the mind hums softly and time seems to dissolve. We've wandered through centuries of nights, through candlelit rooms and creaking beds, through monks, peasants, and kings who all shared one thing: the dark. Now we're here, in the 21st century, surrounded by light, noise, and glowing rectangles, still trying to find the same peace they once knew instinctively. It's strange, isn't it? We've conquered the night and somehow lost our rest in the process. The medieval sleeper didn't have blackout curtains or sleep apps. They didn't count REM cycles or track their heart rate. They just let the night happen. They slept when tired, woke when their body said to, and accepted that stillness wasn't an error, it was part of the rhythm. When they woke between sleeps, they didn't panic. They prayed, talked, sat by the fire, thought about their lives. Sometimes they just listened to the wind, to their heartbeat, to the silence. And then they went back to sleep. No sleep hygiene, no anxiety, just night doing what night does. We, on the other hand, tend to panic at the first sign of consciousness. It's 3:04 a.m., the brain whispers. You should be asleep. The clock glows accusingly, and the mind starts spinning. We've turned rest into a performance, something to optimize, schedule, and monitor. But maybe, just maybe, we don't need to fix it. Maybe waking up at night isn't a flaw. It's a memory. A quiet echo of our ancestors' rhythm humming in our DNA. So next time you wake in the dark, try something different. Don't reach for your phone. Don't start calculating how much sleep you'll lose. Just be. Let the silence sit with you. Watch the shapes shift in the dim light. Maybe think, or pray, or simply breathe. You might just feel something ancient, something human moving quietly under the noise of modern life. That's your first sleep ending. Your second one is waiting. History, in the end, isn't just about battles and kings. It's about the small, invisible habits that built our lives. How we worked, how we ate, how we dreamed, and yes, how we slept. The story of two sleeps is really a story about balance, about letting darkness exist without fear, about remembering that not all wakefulness needs to be filled. The medieval night wasn't empty. It was alive, with thought, with faith, with quiet wonder. And even if we've filled our nights with light and noise, that stillness is still there, underneath it all, waiting for us to notice. So, as you lie here now, eyes heavy, mind drifting, know that you're not alone in the dark. Someone, 700 years ago, lay awake just like this. They stirred the fire, listened to the wind, and thought their strange, gentle thoughts. Then they fell back to sleep. And so will you. Thanks for staying with me tonight. You can close your eyes now. The night knows what to do. Sleep well, time traveler. We'll meet again somewhere between first sleep and second.